Good day and welcome to the Strong Ambition podcast. Your host here, Rylan Qualley, once again, and we're going to dive into nutrition and mindset today with Dr. Glenn Livingston. Dr. Glenn Livingston is a psychologist that actually has his own system for helping people overcoming their cravings and eating disorders. He has a great story about he overcame his own obesity challenge. He had to go to a psychologist himself. He had to challenge his own inner pig, as he would say it. And he has very unique strategies, but helpful tactics in order to get people to understand how to control their mind rather than actually having food control them. So he's got a terrific story, and he will give you some great fundamental tactics within this interview. So without further ado, here is Dr. Glenn Livingston. Good day there, Glenn. So glad to have him on the show. How are you today, sir?
I'm good. I've been looking forward to this all week.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Well, I actually don't do a really in-depth introduction. I want you to give me an in-depth introduction for the listeners. So tell my listeners about who you are, how you grew up, and how you got to where you are now.
All right. So I am not just a doctor who chose to work with overweight people. I used to be almost 300 pounds myself. I like to say that I fought a war with a chocolate bar in 1982 when I lost. And I spent about 20 years buried in bags and boxes and containers. So I had a kind of serious food problem myself. I'm also from a family of 17 psychologists and counselors and psychotherapists and social workers. So it's in my blood. And if anything broke in the house, we all knew how to ask it how it felt, and we didn't know how to fix it. So it's kind of important for my story because I was a little too stuck on a depth psychology approach to trying to overcome my own overeating problems. I'll try to make a long story short, but I essentially, when I was 16, 17 years old, I discovered that because I'm 6'4" and I'm modestly muscular just genetically, if I exercised for 2 hours a day, I could eat whatever I wanted to. But when I got a little older, my metabolism slowed a little bit, and I was, 22, 23 years old. I was married. I was commuting 2 hours each way to see patients and go to school, go to graduate school. And I had to help with my ex-wife's business at the time. I didn't have 2 minutes a day to work out, much less 2 hours. But I found the food still had a hold on me, and it would actually interfere with my seeing patients. I could be sitting with a suicidal person and thinking, oh my goodness, when can I get to the deli and, dislodge my jaw and get the next tray of pizza in there? Thank God I figured that all out. But that really bothered me more than the weight initially, because from the family that I came from, being a great psychologist was always most important to me. And being a great psychologist is really not so much about figuring out the jigsaw puzzle of people's lives. You figure that out after a session or two. What's really important about helping people is that you have to get them to know and love and trust you enough to think new thoughts and take new risks and try new behaviors. And I wasn't fully there. I just wasn't fully there, and that bothered me much more than the weight. And I never lost anybody, thank goodness. But that was my main motivation to fix it. So I went on this long journey trying to love myself then. I saw the best psychologists and psychiatrists and went to Overeaters Anonymous. And the way I describe it is that I thought if I could fill the hole in my heart, that I wouldn't have to fill the hole in my stomach. And it was a very soulful, deep spiritual journey, which I don't regret taking, but I would get a little thinner and a little fatter every time, or a little thinner and a lot fatter. And I, kind of dieted my way up to about 300 pounds eventually. Along the way, there were a couple of things that really changed the paradigm for me from love yourself thin to be the alpha wolf of your own mind. It was the exact opposite paradigm. Those three things were significant because I think they shaped my ability to think about food in a different way than a lot of other people do. I was, in addition to my clinical practice, consulting for big food and big pharma. And I had a lot of time on my hands because my ex-wife was traveling for business, and I was at home. And so I just had time for a second career. And I actually became the CEO of that company. And I was on the wrong side of the war. I was figuring out how to sell sugar to kids, and I was on the wrong side of the war. I feel very guilty about it. I'm trying to make up for it at this time of my life. But what I saw was them putting progressively more money on rocket scientists into engineering these hyper palatable concentrations of starch and sugar and fat and salt and excitotoxins. And it was all aimed at the bliss point of our reptilian brain without giving us enough nutrition to feel satisfied. And the result was this sense of addiction. It occurred to me along the way that really had nothing to do with a hole in my heart. It didn't have anything to do with the fact that my mama dropped me in my head, or her mama dropped her in her head, or I like all of this depth psychology stuff. It didn't really matter, because the reptilian brain, first of all, it was an external force that had nothing to do with my internal conflicts. But secondly, I learned from studying neurology that the reptilian brain doesn't know love. It looks at something in the environment and it says, do I eat it? Do I mate with it, or do I kill it? And there's no love there. You have to have the mammalian brain on top of that says, before you eat, mate, or kill that thing, what impact is that going to have on your tribe and the people that you love? I'm so sorry. Let me turn that off. My apologies.
No worries.
I turn it on just in case you need to reach me before. and then, okay. No alarm set. Airplane mode. Okay. So, it's the mammalian brain that says, before you eat, mate, or kill that thing, what impact will that have on the people that you love? And then the neocortex above that says, wait a minute, what impact is it going to have on your long-term goals, like health and fitness and career goals, and your ambition, your spirituality, your music, your art, your place in society. But really, at its root, overeating struggles, addictive struggles, are a reptilian brain problem. It's the survival drives in the brainstem saying, just hand over the chocolate and nobody gets hurt. It's like pushes aside your rational thinking, right? So at this point, I had also done this 40,000 person study when internet clicks were cheap. And this was the last straw that really pushed me over the edge. I found 3 interesting things from that study. I intercepted people when they were searching to manage stress, and I asked them, what foods did they struggle with when they were dealing with stress, and what were they stressed about? And I found 3 interesting things. People who were stressed about people who couldn't stop eating chocolate, like me, they tended to be a little lonely or brokenhearted or depressed. People who had struggles with chips and salty, crunchy things, they tended to be more stressed at work. And people who were struggling with, bagels and pasta and soft, chewy things, even pizza, they tended to be stressed at home. And, it wasn't perfect correlations, but it was an interesting finding. And at the time, I was really just trying to figure this out for myself. I wasn't going to teach it at all. So I called my mom, who's also a psychotherapist, and I said, Mom, why do people who struggle with chocolate like me go for, why do they tend to be lonely or brokenhearted or depressed? And my mom gets this horrible look on her face. This was over Skype. It's this horrible look on her face. And she says, I'm so sorry, honey. I'm just so sorry. And I said, Mom, it doesn't matter. It was decades ago. I love you. I forgive you. I just trying to figure this out for myself. She said, well, I'm so sorry, but when you were 1 year old in 1965, your father, my husband, was a captain in the army, and they were talking about sending him to Vietnam. And I was terrified. I thought I'm going to be an army widow. At the same time, your grandfather, my dad, had just gotten out of prison, and I had no idea that he was guilty, but he was. He was doing horrible things, and I was devastated because he was my whole life. So Glenn, honey, I'm sorry, but when you would come running to me for a bottle or some love or just to play, I didn't have the wherewithal because I was sitting and staring at the wall. So half the time I had this big chocolate bottle of Bosco in the refrigerator, and I'd say, go get your Bosco, and you go crawling over to the refrigerator and open up the Bosco and suck on the bottle and go into a chocolate sugar coma. And, at that point, I thought, eureka, this is it. This is why. Now I'm not going to have trouble with chocolate ever again. And if it were the movies, if this was a movie moment, then I would have had a big hug and a big cry with my mother, and I would have never had trouble with chocolate again, and everything would have been wonderful in my food life and my life after all. But that's not what happened. What happened was my chocolate struggles got even worse, because it was like there was this voice in my head that said, you know what, Glenn, you're right. Our mama didn't love us enough, and she left a great big chocolate-sized hole in our hearts. And until you can fill it with true love or get out of the marriage, you're going to have to keep on binging on chocolate. Let's go get some more right now. Yippee, let's go do it. It's like there was this justification for it. At that point, I kind of put this all together. I looked at what the food industry was doing. I looked at what the advertising industry was doing, because they're very good at convincing you need the food industry stuff to survive. And I said, those are external forces. I looked at the neurology and I said, my reptilian brain doesn't really know love, and that's really where it seems like the whole problem is. I looked at this study and I realized that having that deep psychological insight, which arguably was the deepest psychological insight I could have had about what started my eating, it didn't work. It made it worse. And I said, this has got to change. There's got to be something different. So I was reading some alternative addiction treatment literature at the time by Jack Trimpey called The Rational Recovery, I think the name of the book was. And he talked about bifurcating the mind into two parts. The part that wanted to, he works with alcoholics, so it was the part that wanted to never drink again and the part that wanted to keep going. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to try that approach also, but I'm going to try it with food. And I did something kind of embarrassing, Ryland. It's, I'm a sophisticated psychologist, and I've been in all these periodicals and newspapers, and a lot of people look up to me, but this is a little embarrassing. And I've been talking about this for 8 years, and I have over 1 million readers, and I'm still a little ashamed. This is how I did it. But I said, okay, I'm going to make a line in the sand, and I'm going to say, I will never have chocolate on a weekday again. And if I hear a little voice, for example, when I'm on the line at Starbucks, staring at the chocolate bar at the counter, if I hear a little voice that says, Glenn, you know what? Even though it's a Wednesday, you worked out hard enough. You can start your silly diet tomorrow. It'll be just as easy. Go get me that chocolate bar right now. Yippee. I would say, that's not me. That's my inner pig. Chocolate on a Wednesday is pig slop. I don't eat pig slop. I don't let farm animals tell me what to do. You see how this was not loving myself then? This is just like the total opposite. And a lot of people say, well, thank you, Dr. Sensitivity. They don't really get this approach, but you'll see where it works later on. It's the first thing that I did that was very aggressive at the moment of impulse. And I found that I didn't miraculously get better. What was a miracle was that I would wake up at that moment of impulse and have a few microseconds to make a different choice if I wanted to. At first, I usually ate the chocolate anyway, but I had those seconds, and it's like I knew what was going on now. I didn't feel like there was this mysterious force inside of me, or that some deep psychological insight was going to cure me. I said, no, there's this thing inside of me. It's a very powerful biological urge, just like the urge to pee. And I'm capable of directing my urge to pee. Like, I kind of have to pee right now. I'm not going to go do that because I'm talking to you. I'm capable of directing that. Why can't I direct this urge to have chocolate or pizza or whatever else it was? And from there, I would get like a longer and longer pause. And I started experimenting with different types of rules. And I started experimenting with disempowering what the pig would be saying. So for example, it would say it would be just as easy to start tomorrow, but that wasn't actually true logically, because the principle of neuroplasticity says what fires together wires together, which means that if I have a craving for chocolate and I think I can just start my diet again tomorrow, and then I eat the chocolate, I've reinforced both the craving and the thought. So I'm more likely to say, start tomorrow again tomorrow, and I'm more likely to have a deeper craving, a harder craving tomorrow. Look, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Always use the present moment to be healthy. So I developed these I call them cognitive refutations. I would poke holes in my pig's logic. And I found that the impact of that was often to get me to make the right choice, because it would become psychologically uncomfortable for me to do what the pig wanted me to do without cover. Over many years, I journaled about all the different things my pig would say, and I came up with the reasons that it was wrong. And that's how I largely got better. When I published the book, I got divorced in 2015, and I published the book, and it took off relatively quickly. I was besieged with requests for coaching. So I opened these coaching programs, and I focused in the coaching programs on fixing people's thinking. Like, how could I do for them what I did for myself, but a lot quicker? And I got it to the point that within a month or so, people were telling me they had 90% fewer overeating episodes, mostly by fixing their thinking. We kept careful track of the stats, and we have data from well over 1,000 people. So that's a pretty solid number. If people stop using the tools, it does fall back a little bit, but at the 6-month mark, we're like at 65%, 60%, which is comprised of people that are like 80 or 85% who have kept doing what we told them to, and the rest who just decided not to. So it works. We're able to fix people's thinking very well pretty quickly. But over the course of doing that, and you can interrupt me if you want to introduce.
No, I love this. Keep rolling with this. Yeah.
So over the course of doing this, I observed that there was this particular response, which was like a chink in the armor. I call it the screw it, just do it response, where people would do the work to fix their thinking. And then there would be this moment, and they didn't really know why, where they would say, screw it, just do it. I want the chocolate anyway. I'm going to have a conscious pig party. And this was despite looking very carefully at their motivation. And I've got some very detailed techniques for amping up their motivation, very carefully defining the rules that they wanted to follow, figuring out what this was going to do for them, very carefully disempowering all of the illogical reasons and excuses for breaking the rule, them telling me that they felt 100% confident they were never going to break it. But then there would be these moments when they'd say, screw it, just do it. And I asked myself, how did I manage to recover despite that? Because I kind of remembered feeling like that. My recovery wasn't a straight line. I mean, I definitely made some serious mistakes along the way, but I didn't have any of the techniques that I'm going to describe for you to fight that screw it, just do it response. In retrospect, well, let me just say what the conclusion I came to, which is the reason I wrote the new book, was to eliminate the screw it, just do it response. The conclusion I came to is that response is driven by organismic distress, basically a lack of self-care. Very frequently, it's driven by not enough authentic nutrition, like skipping breakfast, or not getting enough vegetables and minerals into yourself, or having too few calories a day, or trying to just only have liquid shakes all day long or something. That's when people would tend to do it the most, if they didn't have authentic nutrition. But then I also noticed they would do it if there was organismic distress caused by being inundated with stimuli and decisions to make all day long. And that made sense to me, because I know that willpower is the ability to make good decisions, and we only have so many good decisions we're able to make every day. And so I started telling people to take at least 2 5-minute breaks, put down your phones, don't allow anybody to contact you, go into the bathroom and lock the door if you have to, but take 5 minutes twice a day with no decisions. And I started to get a little bit of a bump with that. People did better with that. And then I thought about the other types of organismic distress. There's just plain old breathing. If you breathe in for shorter than you breathe out, you're telling your brain that there's no emergency. Because in an emergency, you'd be huffing and puffing and running from a hungry bear, right? But if you, for example, breathe in for a count of 7 and out for a count of 11, you're telling your brain there is no emergency. It's okay to rest and digest and think and plan. We can be in a state of being more so than a state of doing. And I noticed that people that were willing to do that were less likely to say, screw it, just do it. And then I noticed that other things like not drinking enough water, not having enough social contact, not getting enough sleep, Um, Anything that really would lead to an unnatural level of organismic distress made it more likely that people were going to say, screw it, just do it. And so I recognized that, oh, it's not enough to fix people's thinking. I think I might be the best in the world at fixing people's thinking about overeating. I don't know it's kind of please don't tell my mom I'm being immodest, but I don't know anybody else that's worked with 2,000 overeaters and done it in this really weird way like I have. So I'm at least among the best people in the world at fixing people's thinking about their eating.
Sure.
But that's not enough, because the reptilian brain has the ability to push aside our rational thinking to take urgent action. So when it falsely perceives there to be an emergency, at those times it feels like your thinking doesn't matter. So then there's this whole new focus on needing to turn off those false alarms and really engage in more self-care, which sounds trite, and I never thought I would have come to that conclusion, because I was very much about the intricacies of the cognitive fix. But it's not enough to fix your thinking. You actually have to take care of yourself too. And I learned an awful lot about the science of cravings, which kind of helped alter the technique. And I put together a revised set of steps for overcoming overeating, and that's really what the Future Cravings is. It's the 8-step process for overcoming that. And so now I've got 20,000 reviews in my old books, and over 1 million readers, and over 1 million readers in Psychology Today also. And people don't really recognize me by name, but they'll point at me and go, "You're the pig guy, aren't you the pig guy?" So, which is great on a first date, I have to say.
Oh my, I can imagine. That's a heck of a story. I think that's truly incredible. And there's one thing that just has to be highlighted, is walking the walk and talking the talk, going through your own evolution, having to rewire your own brain. You had to get your own psychologist help. And I think that's super important for people to value, because, it's really hard to fix these problems alone. To have someone to support, to talk it through. Coaches need coaches, therapists need therapists. So I think I love hearing that, and hope a lot of people understand that part of the message. I want to dive a bit more into the idea of psychology of cravings, because you narrowed it down pretty well. How do we really comprehend it, like on a more layman's term, what's going on with cravings? And let's also, we can play it in two cases. In one case, where a person has okay nutrition, and there's another case where a person has good nutrition, but then they still have cravings. How can we really break down the understanding what's going on with someone?
So cravings are not a sign of a diseased mind or a mental sickness. They're a sign of a healthy mind, healthy brain doing its job. Imagine it's 100,000 years ago, and there's this caveman named Thag. And Thag it's a fairly scarce food environment, and he happens to see a monkey, and he follows that monkey to a banana tree. Thag gorges himself on bananas, which, by the way, would have been an evolutionary advantage to be able to eat a lot, because food might be scarce and you don't know when the next one is coming. So he had a survival advantage to eat a lot. But something interesting happens in Thag's brain. His brain tells him monkeys equal bananas. Monkeys are like a signal. And now he gets excited when he sees a monkey. He actually feels a little happy thinking he's going to get to a banana tree when he sees a monkey. His brain motivates him with that excitement and very specific images to go and do that. If our brain was not a calorie acquisition machine, if it wasn't very efficient at learning and then automating those behaviors, we would have died out, right? And the people who were better, people who had stronger cravings and better at automating those behaviors and got more excited about the monkeys, were more likely to live. So that's the first thing, is to understand that you kind of have to wipe away all these notions that, it's because of something horrible that happened to you, or it might be that you learn things, like the initial turning to chocolate, for example, was because my, mother wasn't taking care of me in the way that she should. But once you start doing that, your brain takes over and it becomes a fire in and of itself. And solving the loneliness that I felt or the depression that I felt from that original disconnection with my mother um, might be good for my psychology, but it's not necessary to do that in order to overcome my overeating. So that's one part of the equation. Remind me of the question again. Like, how do you?
Yeah, so it's just how for people to understand better where they're coming from, because your specific story of where the craving kind of originated. And I mean, you got a mixed bag of people where people are having cravings, and you mentioned lack of nutrition could be an issue, but there's also people who have good nutrition, but cravings still exist.
Yeah.
And so are we mostly looking at possibly something relating to their psychology over a long period of time that's developing an instinct with these foods?
I don't think so. I don't
Okay.
think so. I think that psychology leads to the initial exposure. And
Right.
so you can have these fascinating conversations about why some people crave, chips and other people crave chocolate. But the way that the craving works is really very scientific. It pairs with a food signal. So you pass by the Starbucks sign and you go in to get coffee and chocolate. Now you have a craving whenever you see the Starbucks sign. Most of the things that people crave are supersized stimuli. They're not, people usually not craving broccoli, although it's possible. They're craving pizza and chocolate bars and bags and boxes and containers that are artificially compressed sources of calories, not so much nutrition. When you're exposed to a supersized stimulus, your brain lights up, where all of us, by the virtue of having brains, some people a little more than others, but really all of us are wired to form that learning as quickly as possible. And so it doesn't really matter how you got to the food signal. And a food signal, it could be the monkey, it could be the Starbucks sign, it could be the feel of the warmth on your skin at the beach, creating a craving for ice cream. It could be internal that time of month, or it could be a particular feeling. It doesn't really matter how you got there. Your brain is going to notice what signs and signals make it more likely that you're going to acquire that high level of calories for less effort in the future. And then it's going to try to automate that. So it's like a correlation, but not a causation. So there is an association, but I find that it's not really in people's best interest to try to solve their emotional problems in order to fix their cravings. It's better to work on severing the link between your emotions and the overeating. It's almost like, if the emotions are the fire, you could have a roaring fire in the middle of a living room. If it's got a well-contained fireplace, that's an asset, not a liability. It's only if an ash can get through the fireplace that you're in trouble. So you need to look for the holes in the fireplace and then sever the link. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it makes sense in terms of it's not the most important thing to know why it's there. It's, you might be able to shed light on it, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It's like when you look at it within someone's, physiology when they're doing training, it's like, oh, your left hip actually turns out more. And, this could have come from whatever part of your sport. I don't really need to know exactly what it is in your sport. We just know that it's there. So now we can work on giving you exercises to improve it. It doesn't matter as much why, that just kind of sheds light on it, but it's not the key to your success.
That's a really good analogy. I appreciate you saying that. I'm going to borrow that from you if that's okay.
Absolutely. No, and I really like that. And is there an inherent difference between just even people? Because I mean, people have different behaviors around there, so I'd imagine it's similar, that there's just different ways that people have issues with their eating. So some people crave and snack, and then some of us will binge. And I'm assuming this would go along with that association of like what caused you to get into this habit. And you talk to the neuroplasticity. What is the routine behavior? So I tend to see a couple different people that way, where some people will snack and have cravings, and they'll snack a lot, and they'll actually have a lot of calories over a long period of time, but they don't think they're having a lot. but they wouldn't call themselves a binge eater. But then there are those who, abstain and then binge, and that would be more myself. So is that more of, again, just the routine behavior teamed up with that unique psychology, or is there something inherently different there?
Um, the short answer is, duh, I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Because I don't focus as much on the why. I
Right.
don't focus as much on what caused it. I can tell you how to fix it.
Right.
The person who is abstaining and then binging needs to get off that feast and famine roller coaster. For a period of at least 4 to 6 months. I get this a lot with people who are taken by intermittent fasting or one meal a day or something like that.
Mhm.
And there are, medical benefits to doing that, which I don't dispute. But I find that for binge eaters, it yields too many ups and downs in their blood sugar and the dopamine levels, and it leads them to stay on that feast and famine roller coaster indefinitely. There's an old poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, I think. This is, when she was good, she was very, very good, but when she was bad, she was horrid. And that's the psychology of a binge eater. And the fix for that is to just set up a rule that says, I'm going to have 3 meals a day with one snack in between or something like that. And I'm going to have my first meal by 10 o'clock in the morning. Like, I'm not going to leave these very long fasting windows where I get to experience that that over restriction, at least for 4 to 6 months. I've done podcasts with the host of the intermittent fasting podcast, and they say that jives with their experience, that you have to get a lot of the binge behavior gone first before you can really successfully become fat adapted and go for those longer fasting periods. So I know how to fix it. I don't quite know exactly what causes it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And I just really value the perspective there on fasting. It tends to happen a lot with binge eaters. I know for myself. And it was a big shift in my own perspective, was that the ability to overcompensate caused the ability to overcompensate. So I called it, instead of a yo-yo diet, it was the pendulum of will. And so when you hold back, and I always imagine this giant mace that you're trying to pull back and your arms are just exhausted from it. And then one day you get the fuck it's just like you said, you just let go and you don't care anymore. Well, all of that momentum that you pulled back from, the harder you pulled, the more it's going to swing the other way. And then what I realized was, knowing in my mind when I'm in the midst of a binge and I'm in this emotional state that, like, I don't know why I can't stop myself, I just want to keep eating. Marijuana didn't help it, but it was also a deep-seated emotional state. I knew, okay, I can fast tomorrow. I guess I'm going to have a really low calorie week next week. I guess I'm going to have to compensate. And there's literally a decision that you make within that moment when you're in this state that makes you comfortable with it. So I started to really encourage people to recognize that your fasting is encouraging your binging, because it's just like, if you tell yourself, even if you're in the midst of a binge, because I'm willing to bet you know the tools better than I do, but my understanding is going to be way deeper than just, stop fasting or stop binging. But it will at least mitigate a good portion of it, because as soon as you turn that on switch and you're starting to get in your binge, you're like, oh, I have to have breakfast tomorrow. Well, that's actually going to get you out of that all or nothing and get you out of that rut a little bit more, right?
You need to give up the compensatory behavior.
Yeah.
Because the compensatory behavior leads you to believe that there's a cleanup crew coming tomorrow.
Right.
Like, I can do whatever I want to today. I can make as big a mess as I want to today because there's this imaginary cleanup crew coming tomorrow. And people usually remember that when they were young, they could compensate pretty quickly. But what happens is, as you get older, the damage that's done by each binge is worse, and your ability to recuperate is slower, and your the cells in your pancreas are not quite as vital, so they don't manage the insulin and the blood sugar quite the same way. And you'll find yourself actually engaging the compensatory behavior less. So it becomes, just this cycle of weight gain. And the answer is that you you don't fix a day of binge eating with a day of crazy behavior. You fix it with a week of normal behavior. You
Yeah.
have to eat even more regularly than you ever did before if you made a mistake. And if you stop allowing yourself to compensate, you will find, just like you were saying, Ryland, that without that excuse, it's much harder to keep the binge going. So you'll wind up eating a lot less. This is particularly true for people who purge. And I did not design my system for people that purge, and purging can be dangerous. So I have to make a legal disclaimer. But the people that we have helped who purged, they had to give up the purging. People would come to my program thinking I was going to help them stop binging, and so they wouldn't have to purge. But it turned out they have to stop purging first, and then they would stop binging.
Well, I will say from my own experience openly that my purging was using laxatives, and I only did it for a small period of time, but it was that cleanup crew, literally. And as soon as I, stopped doing it, I was even tempted at times, like wanting to use the compensatory method of laxatives again, but it made me realize you're just excusing your behavior. You have to own it. You have to own that this is the inappropriate behavior. And just masking it with that is not only hard on your system, but you're going to continue to do this. And so if you at least start to stop that, that was the stepping stone to getting in the right direction. And like you say, the compensation is more about just the whole week. Like, it's get back just to being who you are. And then every single time you might, I always said my binges turned into splurges, because I'm not nearly as deep as I used to be, because I started to appreciate the whole evolution of this. And so I'm curious what you really see. What are some of the other major tools and ideas that people need to understand around binge eating and emotional eating?
So it's important to fix those other levels of organismic distress. So taking a couple of 5-minute breaks every day without any decisions whatsoever, just to step out of the rat race. There are these studies that show that people have a harder time resisting marshmallows if you make them do math problems beforehand. So it's not just food problems. It's not just food temptation and food decisions that wears down your willpower. Everything. The emails that you decide, do I delegate or spam it or defer it or execute or reply to it now? That wears down your willpower. Deciding what you're going to wear for the day wears down your willpower. You need a couple of breaks every day without making any decisions whatsoever to have a little bit of willpower replenishment. Sometimes even a 5-minute cat nap. I mean, I remember back in the day, I had a very full practice for a while, and I would between patients, sometimes I would go in the closet and lie down for 5 minutes, and it made all the difference in the world. I could think straighter. I wouldn't think as much about food between that. So that helps. We talked about the breathing. There's a way to automate your best thinking at the time of temptation, because people will do this work to develop better thinking in response to the squeals. But then at the moment of temptation, they have a hard time remembering that. I call this the doggy sneeze for cheese routine, because it's the best way to explain operant conditioning that I've come up with. In psychology, there's a phenomenon called operant conditioning, which basically means that behaviors that are followed by a reward are more likely to reoccur. And there was this one time that I was standing by the refrigerator, and I had a 125-pound Doberman Pinscher at the time named Damien. And I'm a Whole Foods plant-based person now, but back then I wasn't. And I was eating a big piece of cheese, big piece of American cheese. And Damien comes strolling up to me, and I happened to be eating the cheese, and he sneezed. And I just happened to give him a piece of cheese at that point, just because he was there. And you can see the wheels turning in his head, and he sits down and he looks up at me very intently, goes, sneeze equals cheese. So he does it again. And because I'm a sicko and I thought that was funny, I gave him another piece of cheese. And wouldn't you know, from then on, and I kept on doing it over the years, but whenever he walked by the refrigerator, if I was by the refrigerator, he would sneeze for cheese. Well, that's an example of operant conditioning. I taught Damie that sneezing equals cheese. It turns out you're always teaching your brain that certain thoughts equals a food reward. So the thoughts that you have immediately before you reward yourself with food are more likely to recur. We talked about that with the Start Tomorrow squeal. You can take advantage of that. You can take advantage of that by reciting a little mantra at every meal before you eat. And like the heavens don't open up immediately, and the doesn't instantly fix the problem. But if you do it pretty regularly, then you'll find that when you start to think about any type of food, any type of calories, that mantra starts to pop up into your head. So for example, suppose I'm most bothered by the squeal that says, just one bite won't hurt. Maybe I wrote a refutation that says, well, one bite is a tragedy because it's the difference between who's in charge, you or me, Mr. Pig. It's a totally different way of life. And so the shortcut for that is one bite's a tragedy. Well, now if every time before I eat, I tell myself one bite off plan is a tragedy, then before you know it, whenever I start to think about eating anything, I'm going to hear in my head, one bite off plan is a tragedy. So you can start to put things into that pause between stimulus and response before you eat that will get reinforced instead of the pig squeals. Sometimes you have to open up that space first. Sometimes people can't, like things are so automatic with their eating, they can't really stop and do that. So I usually tell people to develop their pause muscle first. And this will not feel natural. It's not natural to pause before you eat because our brains are calorie acquisition machines. It was in their best interest 100,000 years ago to automate calorie acquisition with the least amount of thought and effort possible. It's no longer in our best interest. So we have to do something that's a little unnatural to fight the unnatural things that are happening to us in our life with the food industry. So if you just go 1, 2, 3 before you eat, if you just practice doing that, 1, 2, 3, what you're starting to do is intervene in that automatic habit loop and give yourself a little space where you can program your mind the way that you want to. Once you're used to that, you can go 1, 2, 3, and then take a deep breath in for a count of 7 and breathe out for a count of 11. That'll calm you down more. And then you can say, one bite off plan is a tragedy. If you practice expanding that space, there are more things you can do with that technique. You can insert a reason that you're grateful for staying on plan. Like, for example, I'm grateful that I'm following my rules today because it makes me a tall, thin man who can walk in the world and radiate a smiling presence and, be the leader that I want to be and accomplish the things that I want to accomplish, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I could insert some of those things into that space between stimulus response. And then I'll find myself having those grateful feelings and thinking those grateful thoughts before I'm going to eat. And that then becomes something that fights fire with fire. Because the pig will be saying, you're going to be giving up so much pleasure if you don't have the chocolate bar. Yeah, but I'm going to be giving up feeling so grateful and happy and feeling like a tall, thin man that radiates a smiling presence if I do have the chocolate bar. So you're fighting fire with fire. It's not all about the long-term goal. So you can do that. We teach people to make a recovery plan. We teach people to, build support in the community. You can figure out, once you've done some of these refutations and the kind of crazy pig thinking that your pig presents to you to get you to break, if there's going to be an event coming up, you can schedule an email to arrive from your higher self to your lower self just before, during, and after the event. So let's say you're going to go play poker and you're typically, tempted to binge on pizza when you go play poker with the guys. You can send an email to show up, the morning of, to explain to you why you've decided not to eat pizza at the poker place. You can remind your mind what you'd like to think instead, what your mantra is going to be. You can remind yourself what you've planned to eat, and maybe there's some activities that you need to engage in before you go. So you remind yourself that you got to pick up a half a pound of grapes and a couple of nuts and seeds or something to take with you to the poker game. So you you have these ways that you have your higher self show up at the moment when your lower self is going to want to be dominant, and that makes a big difference too. So
Love
there's this,
that email. That's a really cool idea
yeah.
because you're able to plan when you're not in the actual emotional state, which I think is really significant. The emotional drive of being in that moment. We're entirely different people, right? It doesn't matter the intentions. You're like, yeah, I'm going to go in and be good. And then you come out of there like, what happened? It kind of flies by you. Something overcomes you. There was a great guest I had on, Del Spragon. I highly recommend you check out some of her stuff because she talks about really in a different form, talking about more of the subconscious mind driving the decisions even before you rationalize it with words. And it's a really interesting way to think. Rather than saying that we think, feel, and act, we feel, act, and think. So her justification or understanding, and I really do appreciate this point, is that, at a very, very probably reptilian brain level, you have things driving and you're starting to do it. And then after your body's like, oh, well, that's why I did that. I felt this way because this. And we're justifying our actions after.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great because you mentioned the pause, and that's a big part of her system, is just to take this pause to give yourself an opportunity to shift out of it. And what she really talks about is to pay attention to how you're feeling physically, and how emotions are far more physical than we actually realize.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done a lot of this, a little bit of our work myself, and I noticed a big difference. So I really love how you're talking about pausing and what we even tend to do with our day-to-day food. And I think this is something that has made a huge difference for me, and I hope a lot more people do. When you're on a good meal plan and you're having what should be seen as a good, healthy meal, are you actually trying to enjoy it? Because if we only save the enjoyment for the treat foods and the desserts and all that stuff, when you're having your basic lunch at work and then you're scrolling on Instagram or YouTube and you're just kind of eating, maybe you're playing a podcast, like you're not paying attention to how much you're enjoying the food that's supposed to be giving you good food enjoyment and nutrients. But we're always, and then even when people do eventually have their pizza or whatever, they're also distracted. So the more we can pause, pay attention, and be a part of the food experience, the more satisfying it'll be, even if you're having the desserts, right? And I think that was the next kind of direction I was really curious about, was how do you help people with the moderation of it?
I just want to comment on what you said, and then I'll talk about moderation.
Absolutely, yeah.
We're designed to enjoy food. We're supposed to enjoy food.
Mm-hmm.
People become frightened of enjoying food because they associate it with overindulgence. When you take an inventory of all the food behaviors that are getting you in trouble, and you ask yourself, what role do I want that food or that eating behavior to play in my life? And you make rules to regulate that, and you learn how to comply with those rules, then you're no longer frightened that enjoying the fruit is going to overwhelm you, and you're going to have troubles with your with your body and your health because of it. And so as a natural outgrowth of that, you confidently enjoy your food an awful lot more. And it's really important to get pleasure from your food and to get pleasure from other things. We're designed to experience pleasure. It's really important to do that. Okay, then there's the moderation versus abstinence debate. Should I give up sugar entirely, or can I have some? Right. And I find that it's an empirical matter. There are 2 out of 3 people that can moderate, and that's a matter of drawing very specific boundaries and not leaving it up to chance what the decisions are. But for example, let's say I never eat bread except for 2 slices in a restaurant when I'm out to eat, or the only thing sweet I have is whole fruit and berries, except for one dessert of my choosing when I'm with family at birthday parties or in a restaurant. So what you're actually doing is not requiring yourself to make decisions at the moment of temptation. In this example, a restaurant's whole business model rests on seducing your pig. The lighting and the way the specials are presented, the way the waiter is taught to talk about them, everything in the restaurant, the smells, it's all designed to stimulate your pig. And so if you walk into those very tempting environments without having made some decisions beforehand about how you might alter your rules or moderate some of the things you're going after, it's like walking into battle wearing a plastic helmet. It's just not a good idea. So I think of an archery target, and I think of your day-to-day goals as being your bullseye, and then you think through all the exceptions. You think through, family events and work events and holidays and vacations and Christmas and New Year's and anything else that might be an exception, and usually draw a wider rung around the bullseye with very specific boundaries. It's important to have the boundaries not only to make the decisions beforehand, but because if you miss, you want to know by how much and in what direction so that you have that feedback to correct your aim the next time. This is why I'm very much in favor of hard and fast rules rather than kind of squishy guidelines, because if you just say, well, I'll try to eat well 90% of the time and I'll indulge 10% of the time, you don't really know where the boundary is. You don't know how to make those decisions. So back to the moderation conversation. There is that 1 out of 3 people who can't seem to moderate. And, and it varies from person to person. It also varies from substance to substance. Some people can't have sugar, but they can have flour. Some people can't have sugar and flour, but they can have cheese. It really varies from person to person. And so, how do you tell ahead of time? It's really hard. And it's a little risky because you could wind up overeating if you're trying to moderate and you really need to be an abstainer. I have 2 exercises that I have people engage in. The first is, if you try 4 conditional rules, we have really 3 types of rules. We have never rules, this is where you give up a food entirely. We have conditional rules, which is where you'll say, I'll only have pretzels at Major League Baseball parks. And then you have always rules, which are things that you'll always do. If you've tried 3 or 4 conditional rules and you're not able to keep to them, the odds are that the substance you're experimenting with is something you have to abstain from. I've seen people try 20 different rules over the course of 2 years before they came to the conclusion they really couldn't do that. And I would like to save you that suffering. People want their freedom, and my program is diet agnostic. I'll support you to do what you want to do within reason. But if you're going more than 3 or 4 times, probably you're not going to make it. The other thing is, if you're really not sure, you can create 2 versions of your rule. So for example, suppose one rule is, I will never eat chocolate again, which is that's where I eventually wound up, by the way. I became a person who just doesn't eat chocolate. You say, I'll never eat chocolate again. The other version is, I'll only ever have chocolate on a Saturday and no more than 2 ounces. So you have these 2 rules and write them on 2 sides of the paper, draw a line down the middle. Then take a deep breath and relax. And imagine a future in which you tried each one for a whole year. So what might it be like a year from now if you adopted the rule that I'll never eat chocolate again? And you imagine what you see, not just physically, not just in terms of your weight loss, but in terms of the look in your eyes and the energy in your step and your relationships and your productivity and your breathing and your emotional mood and everything you can imagine it, and paint a vivid picture of that future. Then step back and do the same thing for the other rule. I'll only ever have chocolate on, I forgot exactly what I said. Maybe it was Saturdays and only 2 ounces.
Yeah.
Imagine what that future would be like. Now, if in your imagination those futures are not that different, probably it's worth trying the moderation, because that means that unconsciously you're not really perceiving that it's going to be that difficult to stick with the moderation. If you find that the moderation fantasy is much worse, what that means is that unconsciously you probably know that you're not going to be able to moderate. So those are the 2 exercises I have people. I actually have a little worksheet that comes with the freebies when you sign up on the site. That is called the abstinence versus moderation worksheet, and it takes you through those things.
I think that's really cool. I love the idea of, imagine your future. And I think even when I was working on some of the adult stuff with a shift, was when I tried and practiced, it was like, well, I imagine my future of me behaving in this way or this way, and which person did I want to be? And it allowed me to shift into a new instinct because I wanted to be the other person. And I think that's a really good framework for people to think about. And absolutely, there's so many different types of people. I've seen the same thing. I thought it was initially bad for someone to have a little bit every day. I'm like, no, wait, that's good. And then another client couldn't go 2 weeks without one treat.
Yeah.
And so it's like you have to actually allow them to know what's right for them and create some real rule structure that, like you mentioned, before you get there, have the decision made and then just execute. And that makes it a lot less taxing on you. One of one of my last questions here is just actually in regards to that language around the pig. And I'm open to your perspective, certainly. Now, I'll actually say I have a similar language that sometimes comes out, and I try not to, but I have my inner fat kid, is what I say, my inner chubby kid. I was worried about the negative connotation towards myself in that. And I was curious if you always continue to use the term inner pig, or if you're not concerned about the negative connotation towards self.
I'm not concerned about it for myself, and most of the people I work with use something like that. It's not necessary. You could call it your food monster or your goblin, or you. What you have to recognize, though, is that the way that your inner food enemy is defined is as a sociopath. It only consists, by definition, of all the thoughts, feelings, impulses, and images that suggest that you break your plans. It doesn't care how much it hurts you. It doesn't care how much it hurts people that you love. It only wants the slop, and that's it. And the reason it doesn't work as well to have something, lovey-dovey like your inner wounded child that you're trying to nurture back to health, it is because the force with which the reptilian brain overtakes the rational brain at that moment of impulse is incredibly strong. And you need something that's going to give you almost a sense of disgust, like, whoa, who's in charge here? Like, there's a wolf at the door and I better take charge. You need something to wake you up like that. These techniques tend to improve people's self-esteem, not decrease them. But like I said, you don't have to use the word pig if you don't want to. Ryland, I'm going to have to go in a minute or two. I'm so sorry.
That was my last one. The last thing I just want to say is maybe tell people about your book and where they can find you.
It's called Defeat Your Cravings at defeatyourcravings.com. You can get a free copy if you go to defeatyourcravings.com and click on the big blue button. When you do that and you sign up for the reader bonus list, you will also get a set of free food plan starter templates. We're diet agnostic, so this works on, keto or macrobiotic or point counting or calorie counting or whole foods, plant-based, whatever you do, as long as it's reasonable. We have some food plan starter templates that might work for you. The last thing I have there is a set of full-length recorded coaching sessions. It's all free because I know that it sounds really weird that Ryland has this doctor on who has a pig inside of him. And it sounds kind of cruel in the abstract, but if you listen to me coaching some people, it will sound very compassionate, and it takes people from feeling very despairing to feeling very enthusiastic and hopeful in just one session. So I wanted you to hear that. Defeatyourcravings.com, click the big blue button.
All right. Thank you so much, Glenn. I appreciate you for coming on today.
Okay. I'm going to run. Will you email me with stuff when you? Okay.
You bet. Absolutely.
Thanks, man. It's nice to talk to you. Okay.
You too. Thanks again to Dr. Glenn Livingston. I really enjoyed that conversation because not only was it about one of my favorite topics, which is emotional eating, binge eating, and food, but his story is so impactful because he came from obesity himself as a psychologist. So you're coming from someone who's actually walked through it, but also has almost the challenge of being a psychologist where you can be over analytical on all of these things. And for him to be able to actually experience at an emotional level all of the things that he would need to in order to conquer this makes it more impactful. It's like if you were to seek out someone for being an alcoholic and they were a psychologist, well, just talking to a psychologist who wasn't an alcoholic will not have that same experience. Now, I'm not saying you have to go seek out someone who is an alcoholic in order to get over it, but it has that much more insight for you. I actually am pretty critical on people who I see online who are training coaches and nutrition coaches who you can tell never really came from a large weight issue. That doesn't mean that their information is wrong. I'm just saying that they won't know the challenges. And this is the analogy I always make is if you were to take business advice from someone who inherited a well-running business. Now, doesn't mean that they're not successful. Doesn't mean they don't know how to make money. But if they didn't know what it was like to be broke originally, and their father started the business, well, they might not know the same initial struggles. And he went through these struggles himself. And he even had his own psychologist. And I just want to really frame that up for you, how important that is, because accountability and support matters. When you're going to try to go through something like this, having support matters. Talking to someone, having accountability. I have to practice this task, and this person is relying on me to do it and helping me through it. And that is so impactful. I think it is one of the key assets to any good successful program, is to have support through it so you don't feel like you're in it alone. And the trial and error process doesn't only need to be reflected on by you, but by others supporting you through the process. And he talks about the reptilian brain, which I think is really good because, as I had mentioned about Adele Spragon, who was on, I think, just over a year or so ago, highly recommend you go back and check that episode out if you enjoyed this one. But they are saying similar things with different language. He has a much more like analytical approach, being a psychologist, and she talks more about this subconscious mind, which could be basically somewhat similar to the same. And when he describes the reptilian brain, how it has such a driving force, it makes a lot of sense, because there isn't really as much emotion in it as you think. There might have been emotion attached to the instinct initially, but it could be just a deep-seated mindset that's just really been ignited from a previous experience. And then I really actually value that he pointed out, it's like, but that doesn't even matter. It's actually a really good framework. It's a helpful framework. So you don't actually have to ask yourself why. Ask yourself how you're going to solve it. As I use the analogy for the training in the episode, why your hips turned a certain way doesn't actually help me completely solve a problem. It's how we're going to solve it, how we're going to create a new solution for it is what matters more. The other major highlight I think I want to point out is the pause before and during you eat, is to give these pauses in general. His 5-minute thing is great. I believe naps are amazing, and just breaks from technology and distractions, massive impact for everyone. I think more people need to, even though I love my podcast, I love people listening to my podcast, drive more without podcasts, walk more without podcasts, move around in life without podcasts, and just getting used to your internal thoughts. And pausing before you eat, pausing when you eat, huge impact for just being present in a moment and paying attention to when you eat. And that'll actually, to me, lower the cravings for other foods, because you can actually have natural pleasure coming out from these whole foods in your current meal plan. I constantly try to remind myself when I'm having a big bowl of food is, how good is this? I just always remind myself as I'm enjoying my food, to make sure I enjoy it and to make sure I don't get distracted. And then the really interesting thing, which I kind of see a little different from him, but I value his perspective a lot, not just because of his accolades and how many people he's helped, which is a lot, and thousands of people, and a very high success rate. So he understands what he's talking about. But the language around inner pig, I thought was really interesting, because I still do have the inner chubby kid that I refer to at times. But the way he framed it up, I was very open to, because if we're talking about the intentions and the actions are actually being driven more so from the reptilian brain, as you mentioned, it's not actually necessarily emotional. It's actually not emotional. It doesn't care about your long-term goals and wants. It just wants the energy. It just wants you to serve this need. And so that having that hard rule and having that identity shift, where you call it whatever you want to call it, your inner craving monster, can be really helpful, where you don't see yourself as it and you don't want to be it. And there was a really interesting reminder there from me when I talked to my mom about when she quit smoking. She would call it her inner goblin or something like that. And there's a little green monster, and there was one commercial that would always come on TV, and it had this little green monster that would always want to create cravings for a person. And my mom said it helped to identify that craving as just being a little monster. And so for some people, I think that framework actually probably would work, because you don't want to identify it as self. You want to maybe identify it as former self, but it's not the self that you want to continue with. So I'm very open to the language that works for an individual. like I say, he's got some accolades to back it up. And so with that, I personally downloaded his book he mentioned. I went to the website and I will be reading it myself, and I'll give you feedback on that to let you know how some of the tactics work for me as well. And I recommend you check it out because it's free. So go to that website and find out more from him. And he's got a ton of stuff on there, and he's been on many podcasts himself, so you can learn more from them. And maybe it can help you out with your own food craving habits and understand your own food psychology even more. So thanks for listening today. And remember, it's not about the pursuit of happiness. It's about the happiness within that pursuit. And I'll catch you next time.